The hooded man lunges for my bag, his fingers brushing the strap. My designer tote swings hard, cracking bone. The train station blurs as I run, heart hammering, because Thomas didn't just hire a thief. He's watching every move. The files in my pocket are proof. Proof that could save my children or bury me. The platform empties. His voice cuts through the crowd. "Sarah?" Too late. He already knows. Sarah Miller sat in the dark of her home office, the only light coming from the pale blue glow of her laptop screen. Outside, the Greenwich night was silent. A heavy, manicured quiet that felt more like a gag than a comfort. She could hear the faint, rhythmic thud of Thomas's footsteps in the hallway, the heavy, confident stride of a man who owned the floor beneath him. 1, 2, 3. She counted them under her breath, a habit that kept her heartbeat from racing out of her chest. Her fingers moved with surgical precision across the keys. She wasn't just browsing, she was excavating. The folder was labeled Project Sunset, a name that sounded more like a retirement plan than the digital execution of her life. Inside were the files Thomas had spent months meticulously forging, records of bank transfers to offshore pharmacies, doctored medical reports claiming she was a hopeless addict, and even a journal she had never written, detailing a desire to abandon her children. She slid a small silver drive into the side of the machine. The metal felt cold, like an icicle against her palm. A soft hum vibrated through the desk as the transfer bar began to crawl. 10%. 20. The air in the room smelled of lemon polish and the faint, metallic scent of the cooling fan. She kept her eyes on the door. If Thomas walked in now, the narrative would be set in stone. He would see the addict trying to steal his work. But the bar hit 100% with a soft chime that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. She yanked the drive out, tucking it into the secret lining of her blazer just as the brass handle turned. Thomas entered, his silhouette sharp against the hallway light. He didn't speak at first, just stood there cracking his knuckles. Pop, 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 starting with the left pinky. The sound made Sarah's skin crawl. It was the sound of a predator checking his teeth. "Still working, Sarah?" he asked, his voice a silky, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You look tired. There are circles under your eyes that even your expensive creams can't hide." "Just finishing the guest list for the gala," she lied, her voice steady, though her heart was a hammer against her ribs. She closed the laptop with a soft click. "Everything has to be perfect." "It will be," Thomas said, stepping closer. He smelled of expensive bourbon and cold rain. He reached out, his hand hovering near her neck, before he simply straightened the collar of her jacket. "I've made sure of it." The next morning, the gray fog of Manhattan swallowed the train as it pulled into Grand Central Terminal. Sarah stepped onto the platform, her hand gripping the strap of her designer tote so hard the leather bit into her shoulder. The station was a cathedral of chaos, 1,000 footsteps echoing like a drum circle against the marble floors. The air was thick with the smell of scorched electricity and stale pretzels. She spotted Marcus Thorne near the information booth. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who lived in the margins of spreadsheets. He was rubbing his palms against his thighs, his eyes dartled behind thick, wire-rimmed glasses. As she approached, he didn't look at her face. He looked at her hands. "The wind is biting today," she said, the code phrase they had agreed upon. "It's 32 degrees. Marcus replied, his voice flat and numerical. A freezing point. They moved together into the flow of commuters, two shadows in a sea of gray suits. Sarah felt the weight of the silver drive in her pocket like a hot coal. As they passed a pillar, She let her hand drop. The transfer was seamless. A brief touch of cold metal, the drive sliding from her palm into the pocket of Marcus's oversized trench coat. "Don't call me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the screech of a departing train. "Just fix it." "I'll find the crack in the wall," Marcus murmured. He turned away, disappearing into the crowd toward the subway stairs, leaving Sarah standing alone in the center of the terminal, feeling lighter and more terrified than she had in years. She turned to head back toward the suburban lines, her mind already calculating the time it would take to get home before the children finished breakfast. But as she stepped onto the platform for the New Haven line, the rhythm of the crowd changed. A shadow detached itself from a pillar. A man in a dark, hooded sweatshirt lunged. It wasn't a stumble. It was a strike. He grabbed for the strap of her tote, his fingers hooking into the leather with a violent jerk that nearly pulled her off her feet. "Hey!" Sarah shrieked, the sound swallowed by the roar of an arriving locomotive. She didn't think. She reacted. She swung the heavy bag, the weight of her laptop and a marble paperweight she'd kept for luck, acting like a flail. The bag slammed into the man's ribs with a dull thud. He gasped, the smell of sour sweat and old cigarettes hitting her face. He reached again, his hand clawing at her blazer, searching for the pocket where the drive had been only minutes before. Sarah jammed her heel down onto his instep, feeling the crunch of bone under her weight. She shoved him back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The man stumbled, his hood falling back for a fraction of a second to reveal a jagged scar across a pale cheek. He looked at her, not with the desperation of a thief, but with the cold, calculated frustration of a hunter who had missed his mark. He turned and vanished into the surging crowd of commuters just as the train doors hissed open. Sarah collapsed into a seat, her hands shaking so violently she had to sit on them. Her heart was a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. She was safe. She had the bag. She had defended herself. She was smart. An hour later, her phone buzzed in her lap. It was a secure message from Marcus. Her thumb swiped the screen, her breath catching. Files open, the message read, "Project Sunset is a roadmap of your own destruction." But Sarah, look at the metadata on the last 3 uploads. Sarah opened the attachment, her eyes scanning the lines of code that Marcus had highlighted. She expected to see Thomas's office computer signature. She expected proof of his forgery. Instead, she saw a series of coordinates. They weren't from an office. They were GPS pings. Phase 1. Smart decision. Sarah felt a surge of professional pride. She had anticipated Thomas might use a private investigator. So she had spent weeks varying her routes, using burner phones, and meeting Marcus in the most crowded places possible. She had been careful, methodical, and invisible. This metadata was the smoking gun she needed. Proof that Thomas was stalking her, which would invalidate his claims of her being the unstable one in court. She felt a wave of relief. She had outplayed him. Phase 2. False positive. She looked at the coordinates again. They were from this morning. 8:15 a.m., 8:30 a.m., 8:45 a.m. They tracked her movement from the Greenwich station all the way to Grand Central. She smiled. He had fallen into the trap. By hiring a low-rent thug to snatch her bag, Thomas had left a digital footprint. She could use this to file for an emergency protective order. Marcus's voice came through the earpiece, sounding impressed. "You got him, Sarah. This investigator, his name is Miller, coincidentally. He's been sloppy with his sinks. We have his whole history now. Phase 3. The crack." Sarah's thumb scrolled further down the log. She frowned. The pings didn't start this morning. They went back weeks, but there was something wrong with the frequency. The pings weren't coming from a car following her. They were too consistent, too close. She looked at the timestamp from 3 nights ago, when she had been locked in her bathroom, crying. The coordinate was the same. Phase 4. Full collapse. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The pings weren't coming from a private investigator outside her house. She looked down at her heavy designer tote, the one she had used to beat back the attacker. She felt along the bottom seam, her fingers dancing over the expensive leather until they hit a small, hard lump no bigger than a nickel, sewn directly into the lining. It wasn't a snatch and grab. The man on the platform hadn't been trying to steal her bag. He had been trying to retrieve it. The metadata Marcus had uncovered wasn't just a log of where she had been. It was a live feed of everything she had done. Thomas hadn't been suspicious. He had been watching through her own eyes. Every meeting with Marcus, every secret file she'd copied, every whispered plan had been broadcast directly to Thomas's server. The attack at the station was a desperate attempt by Thomas to get the tracker back before she met Marcus. But he had failed. And in failing, he had let her see the truth. She hadn't been hiding in the shadows. She had been standing in a spotlight, performing for him. Her phone buzzed again. A new message from an unknown number. "That bag looks heavy, Sarah. Why don't you come home and let me take the weight off your shoulders?" The air in the train car suddenly felt like ice. She wasn't the hunter. She was the bait. The ride back to Greenwich felt like a descent into a tomb. The train's rhythmic clack, clack, clack sounded like a countdown. Sarah sat perfectly still, her bag resting on the seat next to her like a live grenade. She knew she couldn't throw it away. Thomas would know the moment the signal stopped moving. She had to play the part. She had to go back into the house. When she walked through the front door, the scent of lilies hit her. Cloying and sweet, the smell of a funeral parlor. Thomas was standing in the foyer, silhouetted by the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the perfectly green lawn. He was holding a glass of scotch, the ice clinking against the crystal with a sharp, repetitive ping. "You're late for lunch," he said, his voice a smooth caress. "The trains," Sarah replied, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. "A delay near 125th Street. "Understandable." Thomas took a slow sip. "Which is why I've made a decision. To reduce the stress on you, I've moved the anniversary gala forward. It's this Saturday." Sarah froze, her hand still on the brass doorknob. "Saturday? Thomas, that's 3 days away. The catering, the flowers, the—" "It's all handled," he interrupted, stepping closer. He reached out and took the bag from her shoulder. He didn't snatch it. He took it with a terrifying, gentle possessiveness. "I want to celebrate our success sooner rather than later. You've been working so hard, Sarah. You deserve to be recognized." He walked away, carrying the bag and the tracker into his study. Sarah stood in the hall, her heart hammering. He was closing the net. He knew she was moving, and he was cutting her timeline in half to force a mistake. She needed a win. She needed to know what he was planning for that Saturday. That night, the house was a cavern of shadows. Sarah waited until the rhythmic, heavy breathing of Thomas's sleep filled the master bedroom. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She knew every inch of this fortress. She reached the door to his home office. It was a heavy slab of mahogany that smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. She pushed it open, the hinges letting out a microscopic groan that made her blood turn to slush. Inside, the room was cold. She moved to his desk, a massive, claw-footed beast that dominated the space. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, black disc no larger than a button. It was a high-sensitivity microphone she'd bought months ago, just in case. She knelt, sliding under the desk. The space was cramped, smelling of dust and the ozone of the computer tower. She pressed the disc against the underside of the mahogany, the adhesive sticking with a faint snip. Suddenly, the floorboards in the hallway groaned. Sarah's breath hitched. She pulled her knees to her chest, pressing her back against the cold metal of the desk's inner frame. The door opened. A sliver of light from the hallway cut across the floor, illuminating the fine layer of dust on the carpet. Thomas stepped in. He wasn't wearing his robe. He was still in his dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like braided cable. He didn't turn on the desk lamp. He sat down, the leather chair creaking under his weight. Sarah was inches from his knees. She could hear his breathing, slow, deliberate, and heavy. He picked up the phone. The rotary dial made a series of sharp, mechanical clicks. "It's me," Thomas said, his voice dropping into that predatory whisper. "The timeline has shifted. The gala is the endpoint. I want the incident to happen during the toast. It needs to be public. It needs to be undeniable." There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. "I don't care about the cost," Thomas snapped, his knuckles cracking, pop, 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 just inches above Sarah's head. By Sunday morning, she needs to be in the psychiatric wing at Graceview. If she disappears from a locked ward, no one asks questions. Just make sure the paperwork is airtight. He hung up. He sat there for a long time, the silence in the room so thick it felt like it was crushing the air out of Sarah's lungs. Finally, he stood up and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Sarah stayed under the desk for 20 minutes, her body shaking so hard her teeth rattled. He wasn't just trying to divorce her. He was trying to erase her. She crept back to her room, but sleep was a ghost. When the sun finally began to bleed gray light through the curtains, she rose to start her day, trying to mask the terror behind a veil of foundation and lipstick. She walked into her dressing room to get her favorite silk blouse, but she stopped at the threshold. The room smelled wrong. It smelled of her signature perfume, sandalwood and bergamot. But it was too strong, too sharp. She looked at her vanity. The crystal bottle lay shattered on the floor, a jagged star of glass. The liquid had soaked into the rug, leaving a dark, ugly stain like a bruise. She turned to her closet. Her dresses had been moved. They weren't torn, but they were rearranged, organized by color in a way she never did. She ran to her car, needing to get out, to breathe. She punched the ignition and looked at the dashboard screen. She wanted to see her recent destinations, to see if Marcus had sent any new coordinates. The screen was blank. Her GPS history had been wiped clean. No home, no Marcus, no office. Just a blinking cursor in a sea of empty black. It was a message. "I can see you, I can touch your things, and I can erase where you've been." The fear finally broke its banks. Sarah backed the car out of the driveway, the gravel screaming under the tires. She had to get to Marcus. She had to tell him about the incident at the gala. She hit the main road, the black asphalt a ribbon of heat under the midday sun. Greenwich was beautiful this time of year, all blooming dogwoods and white fences. But to Sarah, it looked like a gilded cage. She kept her eyes on the rearview mirror. A black SUV appeared 3 cars back. It was a nondescript, heavy-duty vehicle with tinted windows that looked like sheets of obsidian. When Sarah turned onto the winding back road that led toward the city, the SUV followed. She sped up. The SUV sped up. The road narrowed, flanked by steep embankments and ancient oak trees. Sarah's hands gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. The SUV lunged forward, the roar of its engine a sudden, violent intrusion into the quiet afternoon. Thump. The impact jarred her teeth. The SUV had rammed her rear bumper, a calculated nudge designed to destabilize her. Sarah's car fishtailed, the tires shrieking against the pavement. Oh God, she whimpered, her voice a low drone. 1, 2, 3, 4. The SUV hit her again, harder this time. The steering wheel jerked in her hands, a wild animal trying to escape. She saw the driver's side window of the SUV for a split second, a flash of a pale face and a jagged scar. The man from the station. He wasn't trying to scare her, he was trying to kill her. The third hit was the one that did it. He clipped her rear quarter panel at 60 miles per hour. The world spun. The green of the trees and the blue of the sky smeared into a nauseating blur. The car left the road, soaring for a heartbeat of terrifying weightlessness before it slammed into the ditch. The sound was a symphony of destruction. The crunch of metal, the crystalline shatter of the windshield, the violent explosion of the airbags. Then, silence. The air in the car was thick with white dust and the smell of scorched rubber. Sarah's head throbbed, a hot trickle of blood running down her temple. She tried her door. It was crushed, the metal twisted into a permanent lock. She looked out the shattered window. The black SUV had stopped at the top of the embankment. The door opened. A pair of heavy boots hit the gravel. Sarah's survival instinct, honed by years of counting stairs and auditing risks, kicked in. She didn't try the door again. She drew her legs back and kicked at the remains of the windshield. The glass gave way with a jagged groan. She scrambled through the opening, the glass biting into her palms, and tumbled into the mud of the ditch. She didn't look back. She scrambled up the opposite bank and dived into the thick undergrowth of the woods, just as the boots reached the edge of the wreckage. She pressed herself into the damp earth, the smell of rotting leaves and wet moss filling her nose. Through the branches, she saw the man. He stood over her smoking car, a silenced pistol held loosely at his side. He peered into the empty cabin, his face expressionless. "Where are you, Sarah?" he murmured, his voice barely a ripple in the air. He circled the car, looking for a trail. Sarah crawled backward, moving like a ghost through the ferns. She didn't stop until the sound of the SUV's engine faded into the distance. She was a mile from home, covered in blood and mud, with no phone and no car. But as she walked, the counting started again. 1, 2, 3. Each step was a promise. She wasn't going to Graceview. She was going to war. By the time she reached the back gate of the estate, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the lawn. She avoided the main house, slipping into the mudroom and heading straight for the nursery. She needed to see David and Abigail. She needed to know they were safe. The nursery was quiet, the air smelling of lavender and baby powder. Emily, the soft-spoken babysitter, was sitting in the rocking chair, humming a low tune while David played with his Legos on the rug. "Sarah," Emily gasped, standing up, her blue eyes wide with faux innocence. "My God, what happened to you? Thomas said you'd had a breakdown, that you'd run off." "I'm fine, Emily," Sarah said, her voice raspy. She walked over to David, who was tapping his fingers on a blue plastic brick. Tap, 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 tap. "Mommy's messy," David whispered, not looking up. Sarah knelt beside him, her heart breaking. She looked at his toys, the meticulously organized rows of soldiers and blocks. Her eyes caught on a new addition, a small, plush bear sitting on the shelf, its glass eyes reflecting the dim light. She picked it up. It felt heavier than it should. She felt the back of the bear's neck, her fingers finding a hard, rectangular shape under the fur. She ripped the seam open. A small, black transmitter tumbled out, its red light blinking like a taunt. She looked at Emily. The girl's face didn't change, but her posture shifted. She stopped tilting her head like a wounded bird. She stood up straight, her blue eyes turning cold and flat. "He pays very well, Sarah," Emily said, her voice devoid of its usual melodic lilt. "And he's right, you know. You are unstable. Look at you. Covered in blood, ripping up your son's toys. Who do you think the judge will believe?" Sarah realized then that there was no corner of her life that Thomas hadn't poisoned. Her bag, her car, her bedroom, and now her children's nursery. The next morning, the trap was finalized. Phase 1. Smart decision. Sarah decided to stay. It was the only logical move. If she fled now, she would be a fugitive, confirming Thomas's narrative of a manic episode. She would wait for the gala, use the recording from the desk, and the decrypted files Marcus had. She had a plan to meet Elena Rodriguez, her private investigator, in the garden to get the final piece of evidence, the offshore kickback records. She felt a cold, hard sense of purpose. She was playing the perfect wife one last time to buy herself the hours she needed. Phase 2. False positive. The morning started with a strange, eerie calm. Thomas was polite, even solicitous. He had a doctor come to the house to stitch her forehead, and he didn't ask a single question about the car. "A tragic accident," he told the doctor. "She's been so stressed." He even allowed her to spend the afternoon in the garden with the children. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders drop an inch. He was overconfident. He thought he had her pinned. When Elena slipped through the hedge at 2 p.m. and handed her a thick manila envelope, Sarah felt a surge of pure, unadulterated victory. "This is it," Elena whispered. "Bank records, signatures, the whole paper trail." Phase 3. The crack, Sarah walked back toward the house, the envelope tucked under her arm. She saw Thomas standing at the French doors, watching her. He wasn't angry. He was smiling. That wide, theatrical smile he used in court right before he destroyed a witness. He held up a piece of paper, waving it gently in the breeze. Sarah stopped. Something about the way he was holding it, with a sense of grim, legal finality, made her stomach turn. Phase 4. Full collapse. She stepped into the foyer, and Thomas handed her the paper. It was a temporary restraining order, signed by a judge at 9 a.m. that morning. "Based on your erratic behavior, the car accident, and the testimony of your child care provider regarding your violent outbursts," Thomas said, his voice dropping into that predatory whisper. "The court has found you to be a danger to yourself and others." Sarah looked at the document. It didn't just restrict her. It prohibited her from being within 50 feet of her children. It confined her to the guest wing of the house, under the supervision of a court-appointed monitor, who was already standing in the kitchen. It was James Sterling, Thomas's fixer. "You can't do this," Sarah breathed, the paper fluttering in her hand. "I already have," Thomas said. He stepped forward, his knuckles cracking, pop, pop, pop. "And Sarah, if you try to leave this house with those children, it's a felony. You're not a wife anymore. You're a ward of the state." He reached out and snatched the manila envelope from her hand. He didn't even look at it. He just handed it to Sterling. "Burn this," Thomas said. "And prepare the children. We're moving them to the safe house tonight, for their protection." Sarah lunged for him. her fingers clawing for the envelope. But Sterling stepped in the way, his hand a wall of cold, professional strength. "Don't make this harder, Mrs. Miller," Sterling said, his voice sounding like expensive bourbon. "You've already lost. Now, let's go to your room." Sarah was led up the stairs, counting each one. 1, 2, 3. But the numbers didn't bring peace. They felt like the bars of a cage closing in. She was trapped in her own home, her evidence was gone, her children were being taken, and the man who had tried to kill her was likely waiting just outside the gates. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the mansion became a tomb of cold marble and echoing silence. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed in the guest wing, the door locked from the outside. She could hear the faint, distant sound of Abigail's muffled sobs and the rhythmic tap, 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 tap of David's fingers against a suitcase. Then, the sound of the front door closing, the roar of a car engine. Silence. They were gone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the burner she'd hidden in the mattress. It was Marcus. "Sarah, listen to me." Marcus's voice was frantic, stripped of its usual numerical calm. "The digital archive. It's gone. A remote wipe command was sent 10 minutes ago. Some kind of scorched earth virus. It didn't just delete the files. It rewrote the drive headers. There's nothing left. No Project Sunset, no GPS logs, nothing." Sarah felt the last of her hope wither. "The physical dossier, the kickbacks. Thomas has it," she whispered. "He took it." "Then you have nothing," Marcus said, a heavy silence hanging between them. "Sarah, get out of there. He's going to end this at the gala. He doesn't need you alive to win anymore." Sarah stood up, her eyes catching her reflection in the darkened window. She looked pale, broken, a ghost of the woman who had walked into that diner a week ago. But then she saw the scar on her forehead, the jagged line of stitches. It wasn't a mark of defeat. It was a mark of survival. "No," Sarah said, her voice turning as hard as the granite of the kitchen counters. "He thinks he's the architect, but I'm the one who knows how the building is put together." She remembered the blueprints for the Greenwich Country Club. She had designed the renovation of the ballroom 3 years ago. She knew the service tunnels, the AV wiring, the hidden access points that the elite never saw. She turned to the window. It was a 20-foot drop to the rose bushes. But there was a laundry chute in the hallway that led directly to the basement, and a cold delivery door that Thomas always forgot to lock. She didn't count the steps this time. She just moved. The country club was a sea of white linen and cold crystal. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the sharp ozone tang of the massive projector screens. Men in bespoke suits and women in silk gowns moved like slow-motion predators through the ballroom, their laughter sounding like the clinking of ice. Thomas stood at the center of it all, the man of the year, his jawline sculpted by the overhead lights. He looked invincible. Sarah moved through the dark, damp service tunnel, the smell of grease and stagnant water filling her lungs. She reached the AV booth, a cramped box of blinking lights and humming cooling fans. The technician was gone, likely grabbing a drink before the main presentation. She slid into the chair, her fingers flying across the control board. She didn't need the digital archive. She had the one thing Thomas had forgotten. She pulled a small, battered micro SD card from her bra. It was the backup of the backup, the raw, unedited audio from the microphone she'd hidden under his desk. She slotted it in. On the monitors, she saw Thomas take the stage. The crowd went silent. "Success," Thomas began, his voice booming through the speakers, "is not about what we build. It's about what we protect." Sarah hit the override command. The Man of the Year video flickered and died. In its place, a series of documents blossomed across the 40-foot screens, the kickback records, the forged medical reports, and the metadata of the tracker. But it was the audio that broke the room. By Sunday morning, she needs to be in the psychiatric wing. If she disappears from a locked ward, no one asks questions. The ballroom became a vacuum. The clinking of glasses stopped. Thomas froze, his face turning the color of ash, as his own predatory whisper echoed off the marble walls. Sarah stepped out of the shadows of the booth, her voice amplified by the headset. "You forgot one variable, Thomas," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I'm an auditor. I always check the math." The federal agents, tipped off by Elena hours ago, moved in from the wings. The handcuffs clicked, a sharp, mechanical sound that was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. 2 weeks later, the gray mist of Seattle settled over the Space Needle. Sarah stood on the balcony of her new apartment, the air smelling of salt and rain. Inside, she could hear the rhythmic tap-tap-tap-tap of David playing with his blocks. But it was slower now, a heartbeat of peace rather than fear. She looked at the skyline, a world of muted tones and quiet independence. She didn't need to count the stairs anymore. She was already at the top, the end,